I'm Wilder. I'm 55 years old, and I've spent more than half my life dipping these boots in the mud of the Everglades, Florida. People say I'm crazy for choosing to befriend creatures with fangs instead of humans. But you know what? Animals never lie. The story I'm about to tell you happened 15 years ago, when I was just 40, struggling to keep the exotic Hope Sanctuary afloat. That was the year a lion, a wild dog, and a wealthy businessman taught me the biggest lesson about survival and love. Before we begin, where are you listening to this campfire tale from? Let me know your city or country in the comments below, and please hit that subscribe button to join our wild family. Now, let's ride into the story. The air in South Florida during late October does not breathe. It sits heavy on your chest like a wet, woolen blanket. The sky over the Everglades had bruised to a deep, violent purple, thick with the impending rains of a tropical depression that had stalled just off the coast. The humidity was an absolute physical weight, carrying the scent of decaying sawgrass and damp earth. I was 40 years old then, though the reflection in the cracked mirror of my cramped trailer suggested a man much older. My name is Wilder. My beard was a scraggly, untamed brush of dark hair threaded with premature silver. My eyes, permanently etched with deep lines from years of squinting into the blinding Florida sun, were bloodshot and hollow. I had been awake for 3 consecutive nights. My hands were calloused, the knuckles scarred from hauling raw meat and mending chain-link fences. I was a man who had long ago decided that the company of animals made infinitely more sense than the company of people. People lied. People broke promises. Animals only ever told you exactly who they were. I was not entirely alone in my exhaustion. Sarah, my only full-time assistant, and the closest thing this sanctuary had to an on-call veterinarian, sat beside me in the dim, flickering light of the observation shed. Sarah was 28, impossibly tall and thin, with the kind of sharp, angular posture that made her look like a heron wading in the shallows. She wore wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down the bridge of her nose, and her pale blonde hair was tied back in a messy, no-nonsense bun. She was pragmatic and fiercely intelligent, but she possessed a quiet, aching soft spot for broken things. I knew her history. She had grown up on a sprawling cattle ranch in Texas and had lost her younger brother to a sudden illness when she was just a teenager. That profound, unfixable loss had calcified into a relentless drive to save whatever could still be saved. She rarely smiled, but when she looked at the animals, her hard edges melted into something resembling grace. But neither Sarah nor I mattered that night. The absolute center of our universe was Maya. Maya was an African lioness, roughly 5 years old, whom I had pulled from a bankrupt, dilapidated traveling circus in Georgia a year prior. She was a magnificent ruin when I first found her. She bore a network of pale, jagged scars across her left flank from a trainer's whip, and there was a patch of fur on her broad shoulder that had never quite grown back. Yet, her eyes were a piercing, molten gold, carrying a deep, ancient knowing that humbled me every time she held my gaze. She was a creature of immense, breathtaking power, who had been taught nothing but fear and pain by human hands. Over the past 12 months, through a painstaking process of sitting silently by her fence for hours on end, speaking in low, rhythmic tones, she had learned to tolerate me. Then, slowly, tentatively, she had learned to trust me. And now, she was in labor. We watched through the reinforced glass as Maya paced the straw-lined floor of her enclosure, her massive muscles rippling under her tawny coat. She was panting heavily, her distress echoing in the quiet shed. Sarah kept a steady hand on my shoulder, a silent anchor in the tense hours before dawn. Just as the first heavy drops of rain began to pelt the tin roof, Maya gave a low, rumbling groan. By the time the sun tried and failed to pierce the gray morning clouds, Maya had given birth to a healthy lion cub. He was tiny, blind, and entirely helpless, a squirming golden ball of fur that smelled of warm milk and wet earth. I named him Leo. Watching Maya, a predator who had known a lifetime of abuse, delicately pull her newborn close with a massive, lethal paw, broke something open inside me. She was a mother now. The circus was gone. The whips were gone. There was only the quiet sanctuary of the enclosure, and the fragile new life she was bound to protect. Sarah left shortly after sunrise, her old pickup truck sputtering to life as she headed into town to fetch a fresh supply of antibiotics and formula, just in case. I stayed behind, running entirely on adrenaline and cold, bitter coffee. The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the dirt paths of the reserve into thick, treacherous mud. At around 8 in the morning, the heavy rumble of a delivery truck cut through the sound of the storm. I threw on a yellow slicker and trudged out to the main gate of the reserve to receive our weekly supply of frozen meat and grain. The driver, a heavy-set, perpetually sweating man named Joe, who cared nothing for the magic of the sanctuary, hastily unloaded the pallets, thrust a sodden clipboard into my hands for a signature, and drove off without a word, eager to escape the deluge. As I turned to lock the heavy iron gates, something caught my eye. Pushed against the base of the concrete pillar, half submerged in a rising puddle of muddy water, was a cardboard box. The cardboard was completely waterlogged, sagging and breaking apart. I knelt in the mud and pulled back the sodden flaps. Inside was a puppy, a 2-month-old golden retriever mix, emaciated to the point where every single rib showed sharply beneath his skin. His fur was matted and stained a dirty reddish brown. He was shivering so violently that the entire box shook, his tiny chest heaving with the effort to draw breath. I scooped him up into my bare hands. He weighed almost nothing. I could feel the intense, unnatural heat radiating from his small body. He was burning with fever, but his core temperature was plummeting from the icy rain. I looked into his eyes. They were wide, dark, and filled with an absolute, paralyzing terror. I named him Rusty, right then and there, for the color of his matted coat and the sheer resilience it must have taken to survive being thrown away like garbage. I tucked Rusty inside my coat, holding him against my chest, and ran back toward the main compound. My mind was racing. The power in the veterinary shed had tripped due to the storm, meaning the incubators and heat lamps were dead. Sarah was miles away, stranded by the flooded roads. I stripped off my wet jacket and wrapped Rusty in a dry towel, rubbing him vigorously, but the shivering wouldn't stop. His breathing was becoming shallower, his eyes rolling back. He was dying in my hands. He needed intense, sustained body heat, and he needed it immediately. I looked frantically around the dim, cold room, and then I looked through the observation glass into Maya's enclosure. Maya was curled in a massive golden crescent, radiating the deep, oven-like heat of a 300-pound apex predator. Leo was tucked securely against her belly, nursing contentedly. What I did next was not logic. It was not science. It was a desperate, insane gamble born of sleep deprivation and the unbearable thought of watching a life slip away in my palms. I picked up the towel-wrapped puppy. I unlocked the heavy steel door of the enclosure and stepped inside. The air in the den was thick with the musk of the lioness and the metallic scent of birth. My boots sank softly into the straw. At the sound of the latch, Maya's head snapped up. Her ears flattened against her skull. A low, vibrating growl began in her chest, a sound that you don't just hear, but feel in the marrow of your bones. She bared her fangs, 4 lethal daggers, capable of crushing a zebra's spine, warning me not to take another step toward her cub. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might crack my ribs. "Easy, girl," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "Easy, Maya. I need your help." I knelt slowly, maintaining steady eye contact, showing her my empty hands. I gently unrolled the towel and placed the shivering, feverish puppy onto the straw, just a few feet from her massive paws. Rusty let out a weak, pitiful whimper. Maya froze. The growl died in her throat. She shifted her immense weight, leaning her massive head forward. The tension in the room was suffocating. I held my breath, my hand hovering near the tranquilizer pistol on my belt, terrified that I had just served a dying dog to a hungry lioness. Maya lowered her snout, her whiskers twitching. She sniffed the air. She sniffed the straw. And then she sniffed Rusty. She did not smell the scent of a dog. She did not smell the scent of prey or meat or an intruder. In that tiny, broken creature, she smelled the unmistakable scent of an orphan. She smelled vulnerability. A miracle of nature occurred right before my eyes. Maya extended her tongue, a rough, spiky muscle the size of my forearm, and gently, methodically, began to lick the mud and rainwater off Rusty's trembling body. She bathed him with the same tender, possessive care she had just shown her own cub. Rusty stopped whimpering. The rhythmic, warm pressure of the lioness's tongue seemed to soothe him. When she was satisfied that he was clean, Maya used her massive nose to nudge the tiny dog closer to her chest. She curled her heavy paw around him, pulling him into the profound, radiating heat of her belly. Within minutes, Rusty's shivering stopped. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, his eyes closing as the warmth seeped into his bones. Blindly seeking comfort, Rusty wiggled his way deeper into the golden fur, until he was nestled right beside the lion cub, Leo. I backed out of the enclosure slowly, locking the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I slid down the wall of the observation room and put my head in my hands. A lioness who had known only cages and pain. A dog who had been thrown away into a storm. And a man who watched them, against every law of nature, become a family. Time in the Everglades does not pass, it thickens. The weeks bled into months, and the months stacked themselves into 2 grueling, beautiful years. Under the relentless South Florida sun, Leo and Rusty grew up side by side, transforming into a pair of brothers that defied every known law of biology and nature. They were like twins born in the wrong shell, shaped more by each other's presence than by the DNA woven into their bones. Rusty, now a fully grown golden retriever mix weighing a lean, muscular 60 pounds, had completely abandoned the bouncy, eager-to-please nature of his breed. Instead, he moved with the fluid, calculated grace of an apex predator. His reddish-brown coat blended perfectly with the dying sawgrass, and he spent his afternoons stalking blue herons near the water's edge. He would flatten his belly against the damp earth, his ears pinned back, creeping forward in absolute silence before launching himself in a perfect, terrifying arc. He still barked, but even that sounded different now. Deeper, more guttural, carrying the cadence of a warning roar. Leo, on the other hand, had blossomed into a formidable adolescent lion, weighing over 200 pounds, with a scruffy, awkward mane beginning to frame his massive head. Yet, beneath that terrifying exterior beat the heart of a giant, overgrown puppy. He had absolutely no interest in stalking or asserting dominance. His greatest joy in life was waiting by the chain-link fence for me to toss a heavy rubber tire across the yard. The moment it hit the dirt, Leo would bound after it with clumsy enthusiasm, his massive paws kicking up clouds of dust. He would retrieve the tire in his crushing jaws, trot back to me, drop it at my boots, and roll over onto his back, panting happily with his rough, pink tongue lolling out, waiting for his belly to be rubbed. Maya, ever the protective matriarch, would lie under the shade of a massive oak tree, watching her 2 mismatched sons with a look of calm, regal acceptance. Watching them chase each other under the bleeding violet hues of the Everglades sunset was my only true solace. It was the only thing that kept me tethered to sanity during those agonizing months, because the reality outside the enclosure was entirely different. Exotic hope was quietly, inevitably, suffocating. The sanctuary was on the brink of total financial collapse. The cost of raw meat, veterinary supplies, and basic maintenance had skyrocketed, while the meager donations we received had completely dried up. I was selling off my own tools, my truck, and anything of value just to keep the power grid running. But it wasn't enough. The bank had sent warning after warning, and the shadow of foreclosure had finally swallowed us whole. That was when Richard Sterling arrived. I remember the exact sound of his vehicle, a deep, purring engine that didn't belong on our cracked dirt roads. It was a gleaming, pitch-black luxury SUV, its tinted windows reflecting the wild canopy above. When the door opened, Richard Sterling stepped out into the mud, looking like a man who had descended from a different planet. Sterling was a 60-year-old real estate tycoon from Miami. He was a man who wore expensive, tailored Italian silk suits that somehow seemed to repel the oppressive humidity. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, not a strand out of place despite the swamp breeze. He had the sharp, predatory features of a hawk, with pale blue eyes that operated entirely devoid of empathy. I had read about him in the local papers. He had grown up desperately poor on the fringes of the swamps, and his entire life's work seemed to be a crusade to pave over the very wilderness that reminded him of his past. He viewed the world exclusively through the cold, calculated lens of dollar bills and profit margins. To Sterling, a forest was just undeveloped lumber, and a sanctuary was just wasted real estate. Accompanying him was a man I would later know as Marcus, his personal driver and muscle. Marcus was in his late 30s, built like a linebacker, wearing a tight, off-the-rack polyester suit that strained against his broad shoulders. He had thick, calloused hands and kind, incredibly tired, dark eyes. He was clearly a man just trying to earn a paycheck to feed his family, visibly uncomfortable with the mud on his shoes and the cruelty of his boss's errands, yet completely bound by duty. He stood silently by the SUV, his hands clasped firmly in front of him, staring at the ground. Sterling did not extend a hand to greet me. He simply surveyed the rusting cages, the muddy paths, and the dilapidated veterinary shed with a look of profound disgust. He reached into the inner pocket of his silk jacket, pulled out a thick envelope of crisp legal documents, and held it out to me. "Mr. Wilder," Sterling said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished marble, "I am going to save us both a great deal of time. I have purchased the entirety of this estate's debt from the bank. I own the land you are currently standing on." I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't take the envelope. I just stared at him, the buzzing of the cicadas suddenly roaring in my ears. "You can't do that. This is a protected reserve." "It was a privately funded reserve that defaulted on its loans," Sterling corrected effortlessly, stepping closer. "I am redeveloping this entire sector. Within 6 months, this mud pit will be the foundation for a luxurious, high-end eco-resort, catered to people who want to look at nature through triple-glazed glass while sipping champagne." He finally dropped the envelope onto the hood of my rusted ATV. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises. Remove the animals, clear out your equipment, and be gone. If you are still here on day 31, the bulldozers will simply run over whatever you leave behind." A wave of absolute panic and fury crashed over me. "30 days?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Are you insane? I have over 40 rescued animals here. Lions, bears, exotic birds that have been abused and abandoned. Zoos won't take them. Other sanctuaries are at maximum capacity. If you force them out in 30 days, they will be euthanized. You are signing their death warrants." From the enclosure behind me, Maya let out a low, bone-rattling growl. She had sensed the sudden spike of adrenaline in my blood, the hostile energy radiating from the man in the silk suit. Rusty trotted to the fence line, the fur on his golden spine standing straight up, emitting that deep, unnatural snarl he had learned from his mother. Sterling glanced at the animals, his expression entirely unchanged, as if he were looking at old furniture he intended to throw away. "That sounds like a logistical issue for you to solve, Mr. Wilder, not a financial issue for me to care about," Sterling replied coldly. He turned his back on me, adjusting his immaculate cuffs, and began walking back to the waiting SUV. Marcus opened the heavy door for him, shooting me a brief, apologetic glance before looking away. "Please," I yelled, abandoning whatever pride I had left. I ran forward, stepping directly in front of the massive black grille of the SUV, pressing my hands against the hot metal. "Mr. Sterling, I am begging you. I will pay you back. I will find investors. Give me 6 months. Give me 3 months. You cannot just pave over a family. My desire, my only desire in this life, is to provide a home for these voiceless beings. They have nowhere else to go." Sterling settled into the plush leather seat. He looked at me through the open window. There was no anger in his eyes, no irritation, only a chilling, bottomless indifference. He had no room for pity. His heart was as paved and sterile as the resorts he built. Without a single word, Richard Sterling pressed a button on his armrest. The tinted glass of the car window smoothly, silently, rolled up, entirely cutting off my voice, my pleas, and my existence from his world. Marcus put the SUV into gear, forcing me to step back into the mud as the massive vehicle turned around and drove away, leaving behind nothing but deep tire tracks in the dirt and the impending shadow of our destruction. The 30-day deadline hung over exotic hope like a rusted guillotine, its blade dropping a fraction of an inch with every sunrise. By the final week, the sanctuary felt less like a haven and more like a palliative care ward. Sarah and I worked in a state of numb exhaustion, making frantic, fruitless phone calls to other reserves, begging for any available space for our animals. The stress was palpable, bleeding into the enclosures. Maya paced her perimeter with restless, agitated energy, while Leo and Rusty abandoned their usual games of chase, preferring to huddle close to the Lioness as the barometric pressure began to violently drop. Nature, it seemed, had decided to mirror the impending collapse of our world. Over the Gulf of Mexico, an unprecedentedly powerful tropical storm had mutated overnight into a monstrous, churning vortex of destruction. The meteorologists on the crackling AM radio in my guard post sounded genuinely terrified, warning of Category 12 equivalent wind gusts and a storm surge that would drown the coastal lowlands. But Richard Sterling did not listen to meteorologists. To a man who believed money could buy the very earth beneath his feet, a storm was merely a minor logistical delay. On the 25th day of his ultimatum, just hours before the hurricane's outer bands were scheduled to make landfall, Sterling arrived at the sanctuary. He was driven, as always, by Marcus, the broad-shouldered, weary-eyed driver who looked deeply uncomfortable in his straining polyester suit. Sterling stepped out of his gleaming black SUV, wearing a lightweight charcoal trench coat, looking utterly immaculate against the backdrop of our decaying, wind-battered reserve. He had come to conduct a pre-demolition asset inventory, eager to ensure I wasn't stripping the property of valuable fixtures before the eviction. "Mr. Wilder!" Sterling shouted over the rising, shrieking wind, his voice laced with profound irritation. "I expect a full itemized list of the reinforced steel caging. I intend to scrap it to offset the clearing costs." Before I could even muster the breath to argue, the sky simply tore open. It didn't rain. The atmosphere dropped an ocean onto South Florida. The wind howled with a deafening mechanical roar, snapping the tops off ancient, 60-foot palm trees as if they were dry, brittle twigs. One of those massive palms, a towering behemoth of fibrous wood and heavy fronds, crashed down directly across the single dirt highway leading out of the sanctuary, completely crushing the hood of Sterling's prized SUV and effectively barricading the only exit. Panic, raw and unpolished, finally cracked Sterling's pristine facade. With the highway blocked and the floodwaters rising by the minute, there was nowhere to go. I grabbed Sterling by the collar of his expensive coat, hauled him out of the blinding rain, and shoved him and Marcus into my concrete reinforced guard post. The guard post was a cramped, utilitarian bunker smelling of stale coffee, wet dog, and mildew. For the next 12 hours, the three of us were trapped in that suffocating space. Sterling paced the tiny floorboards, his Italian leather shoes ruined by the muddy water seeping under the doorframe, muttering furiously into a satellite phone that had lost its signal hours ago. Marcus sat quietly on a metal folding chair, his large hands clasped together, watching the rain hammer against the reinforced plexiglass window. I ignored them both, my stomach twisting into tight, agonizing knots as I listened to the sounds of my sanctuary tearing itself apart in the dark. But the real disaster of that night did not come from the falling trees or the shrieking sky. It came from deep within the mud. Located in the lowest elevation of the property was Subdivision 4, an artificial wetland system enclosed by high-tensile steel mesh. It was the designated home of Brutus. Brutus was a nearly 2-ton male Nile hippopotamus, an absolute titan of muscle, blubber, and localized aggression. He had recently been transferred to us after being confiscated from a cartel-funded private zoo, where he had been kept in a barren concrete swimming pool for 5 years. That confinement had fractured his mind. He was incredibly aggressive and highly territorial, possessing a bite force that could easily snap an adult crocodile in half. His skin was a thick, leathery armor modeled with pink scars, and his eyes were small, dark, and filled with a perpetual, simmering rage. Hippos are not gentle herbivores. They are the deadliest large land mammals on the African continent, and Brutus was a particularly psychotic specimen of his kind. We had spent weeks reinforcing Subdivision 4, but no amount of welding could withstand the sheer hydraulic force of the storm surge, combined with Category 12 wind gusts. Sometime around 3 in the morning, while Sterling finally slept a fitful, exhausted sleep in the corner of my office, a massive wall of water breached the southern levee. The floodwaters slammed into Subdivision 4, uprooting the concrete footings of the high-tensile fence. The steel mesh groaned, warped, and then violently snapped. In an instant, the rising water erased all the carefully constructed boundaries of the reserve. The moats overflowed, the chain-link partitions were submerged. The sanctuary was no longer a series of segregated habitats. It was a single, vast, interconnected lake of swirling brown water and floating debris. And in that chaotic, muddy expanse, Brutus was no longer confined. The entire flooded reserve had just become his personal swamp kingdom, and in his fractured, territorial mind, anything breathing within that water was a trespassing threat that needed to be eradicated. By the next morning, the ferocious howling of the storm finally subsided, replaced by a slow, drizzling rain. The sun struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of gray clouds, casting a sickly pale light over the devastation. I pushed open the heavy steel door of the guard post, my boots immediately sinking into a thick, knee-deep slush of dark, foul-smelling mud. Sterling and Marcus stepped out behind me, their silence a testament to the sheer scale of the destruction. Exotic hope was unrecognizable. The familiar dirt paths were gone, replaced by a stagnant, murky lagoon. Uprooted trees lay tangled in downed power lines. But it was not the visual destruction that chilled my blood. It was the sound, or rather, the absolute lack of it. After a storm of this magnitude, there should have been the frantic calls of displaced birds, the nervous bleating of the goats, the heavy, reassuring roars of the big cats checking their territories. Instead, everything was shrouded in an eerie, suffocating silence. It was a heavy, unnatural quiet that pressed against my eardrums. The water lay completely still, an opaque mirror reflecting the bruised sky. It was the silence of prey hiding from a predator. It was the silence of impending death. I grabbed my binoculars with trembling hands and scanned the murky waters covering the central plaza, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Somewhere beneath that opaque, muddy surface, 2 tons of lethal, territorial fury was holding its breath, waiting for the first creature foolish enough to step into the water. Standing on the rusted iron grating of the guard post balcony, the 3 of us stared out at a world that had been swallowed entirely by the swamp. The torrential downpour of the hurricane had weakened into a persistent cold drizzle, but the sky remained a bruised, unforgiving gray. The air smelled of churning mud, ruptured sewer lines, and the sharp metallic tang of ozone. Beside me stood Richard Sterling. The immaculate real estate tycoon from Miami looked entirely broken by the night's events. His expensive charcoal trench coat was plastered to his trembling shoulders, stained with dark streaks of grime. His perfectly coiffed silver hair lay flat and wet against his skull, and the cold, calculating arrogance that usually danced in his pale blue eyes had been entirely hollowed out, replaced by a raw, unpolished vulnerability. He gripped the wet iron railing so tightly his knuckles were bone white. Marcus, his broad-shouldered driver, stood a step behind him, the muscles in his jaw ticking as his weary, dark eyes scanned the flooded expanse. Marcus was a man who understood violence. You could see it in the defensive set of his heavy shoulders and the scars on his knuckles. But this was not the orchestrated violence of the city. This was the primordial, uncontrollable wrath of nature. I turned away from them and rushed back into the cramped interior of the guard post, my frozen fingers fumbling with the heavy brass keys on my belt. I unlocked the reinforced steel gun cabinet mounted to the wall and pulled out my Dan Inject CO2 tranquilizer rifle. It was a heavy, precise piece of equipment, but as I loaded a high-impact aluminum dart filled with a massive dose of carfentanil, enough to drop an elephant, I felt a sickening wave of futility wash over me. I stepped back out onto the balcony and raised the rifle, peering through the telescopic sight. The mechanics of the situation were hopelessly against me. The maximum effective range of the dart rifle in perfect, windless conditions was perhaps 40 yards. The flooded plaza of Subdivision 4, where the water rippled with unseen movement, was nearly 150 yards away. Add to that the persistent drizzle blurring the lenses, the shifting gusts of wind, and the fact that a hippo's leathery hide is nearly 2 inches thick, and my weapon was essentially a heavy metal stick. I was a spectator to whatever nightmare was about to unfold. Through the magnified scope, I frantically scanned the higher ground of the feline sector. The storm surge had severely damaged the enclosures. A massive oak tree had fallen across the perimeter fence of Maya's habitat, crushing the chain link and providing a makeshift bridge over the deepest floodwaters. And there, stepping cautiously onto the slick, moss-covered trunk of the fallen tree, was Maya. The African lioness looked magnificent and terrifying against the bleak backdrop of the ruined sanctuary. Her tawny coat was plastered to her heavy musculature by the rain, making her look leaner, sharper, and incredibly dangerous. She was a mother, a matriarch who had survived the abuse of a circus and the trials of the wild, and she was operating purely on protective instinct. From her elevated vantage point, she had smelled something fundamentally wrong. The floodwaters had carried the foul, musky stench of hippo dung and stagnant river-bottom mud directly into her den. Leaving Leo and Rusty safely huddled in the dry, concrete-reinforced sleeping quarters, Maya had ventured out to establish the boundaries of her territory. She had no idea that the shallow, waterlogged swamp spreading out before her was no longer a shared sanctuary, but the fiercely contested domain of a psychotic, 2-ton beast. Maya descended from the fallen oak, her massive paws sinking into the knee-deep, muddy water. Felines naturally despise water, but her golden eyes were narrowed, scanning the opaque surface with intense, predatory focus. She let out a low, warning chuff, a sound meant to intimidate any scavengers that might have drifted into her yard. She stepped gingerly over a submerged, twisted section of the Subdivision 4 high-tensile fence. The water rippled gently around her muscular legs. For a brief, agonizing moment, the scene was eerily peaceful. Then, the murky water simply erupted. It did not happen with a warning splash. It was a violent, volcanic explosion of mud and displaced water. Brutus lunged upward from the murky depths with a terrifying, explosive speed that utterly defied his enormous, blubber-laden size. The Nile hippopotamus was a colossal engine of muscle and rage. His massive jaws, lined with yellowed, ivory fangs a handspan long, gaped wide, revealing a cavernous pink maw capable of snapping a crocodile in two. Maya, despite her incredible feline reflexes, had absolutely no time to evade the ambush. Brutus snapped his jaws straight onto Maya's left hind leg. The sickening crunch of bone and tearing flesh echoed across the flooded plaza, reaching us on the balcony a split second later. With a brutal sideways jerk of his massive, scarred head, Brutus tossed the 300-pound lioness into the air as if she were nothing more than a child's stuffed toy. Maya let out a desperate, guttural roar of agony and shock, her body twisting violently in midair. She slashed wildly with her unsheathed front claws, leaving deep, bloody parallel gouges across the hippo's thick snout, but it was like dragging razors across a tractor tire. It barely registered to the enraged beast. Maya fell heavily, hitting the muddy swamp with a massive splash. The thick, suctioning mud immediately dragged her down, coating her golden fur in a heavy, suffocating layer of black sludge. She scrambled frantically, trying to find purchase with her 3 good legs, her golden eyes wide with a sudden, paralyzing realization of her own mortality. Standing on the balcony, I stopped breathing. I raised the tranquilizer rifle, my hands shaking violently, the crosshairs dancing uselessly over the chaotic spray of water and blood. "No, no, no," I muttered, a desperate prayer to a sky that wasn't listening. Beside me, Richard Sterling let out a strangled, breathless gasp. The billionaire stumbled backward, his back hitting the concrete wall of the guard post. He raised a trembling hand to his mouth, his eyes wide and unblinking. All his wealth, his lawyers, his contracts, and his absolute control over the human world meant absolutely nothing in the face of this raw, visceral display of natural cruelty. He was witnessing the absolute fragility of life, and it was tearing his worldview apart. Marcus took a step forward, his hands gripping the railing, his face pale and drawn. We were all trapped, paralyzed by distance and circumstance. Down in the swamp, the water boiled as Brutus advanced. The hippo did not retreat after the initial strike. Driven by the madness of his past confinement and his extreme territorial aggression, he pushed through the thick mud like a relentless, armored tank. He loomed over the crippled lioness, casting a massive, terrifying shadow over her. Maya roared again, baring her fangs, swiping her massive paws in a final defiant defense of her life, but the pain in her shattered leg was anchoring her to the mud. Brutus opened his colossal jaws once more, the massive ivory tusks gleaming dully in the gray light. aiming directly for the back of the lioness's neck to deliver the crushing, fatal bite. Maya closed her eyes, the fighting spirit suddenly draining from her battered body. She was awaiting the final, crushing dark. Time, in moments of absolute, paralyzing terror, ceases to function as a linear construct. Standing on the rusted balcony of the guard post, my heart hammering against my ribs, I watched the massive scarred jaws of the Nile hippopotamus open for the killing blow. I could see the thick strings of saliva stretching between Brutus's yellowed ivory tusks. I could see the resignation in Maya's golden eyes as she lay pinned in the suffocating mud, her left hind leg shattered, her body broken. Beside me, Richard Sterling let out a ragged, trembling breath, the billionaire finally confronting a force in this world that his immense wealth could neither bribe nor bulldoze. We were watching a tragedy written in the ancient, unforgiving language of the wild. And then, a sound ripped through the heavy, rain-soaked air. It was not a roar. It was not the mechanical crack of a rifle. It was a sharp, frantic, echoing bark. From the shadowy mouth of the concrete sleeping quarters, located on the higher, unflooded ground of the feline sector, a streak of reddish-brown shot out into the gray daylight. It was Rusty. The golden retriever mix, now a lean, muscular 60 pounds, had been safely secured inside the den with the lion cub, Leo. But the desperate, agonizing roar Maya had let out moments earlier had pierced the concrete walls. For an animal driven purely by instinct, the scent of blood and the colossal, terrifying presence of a 4,000-pound apex predator should have triggered an overwhelming biological imperative to flee, to hide in the deepest corner of the den and survive. But Rusty did not run away. He ran toward the danger. He ran toward the creature who, 2 years ago, had licked the freezing mud from his dying body and shared the warmth of her own flesh to keep his heart beating. Rusty moved like a fiery arrow released from a tightly drawn bow. His paws barely seemed to touch the slick, muddy earth as he sprinted down the embankment. He did not hesitate at the water's edge. He launched himself over the submerged, twisted remains of the chain-link fence, splashing violently into the knee-deep, murky water of the flooded plaza. The sheer physics of the encounter were absurd, a suicidal mismatch of scale. Rusty weighed roughly 60 pounds. Brutus, swollen with blubber, muscle, and territorial rage, weighed well over 4,000 pounds. It was the equivalent of a small stone being thrown against a heavily armored military tank. But Rusty did not care about physics, and he did not care about death. With a final, explosive leap from the thick mud, the dog launched himself directly at the monster's face. Rusty collided with the hippo's massive, leathery snout. His canine jaws snapped shut, his sharp teeth sinking into the thick, sensitive, pink-mottled skin just above Brutus's right nostril. At the same time, Rusty's front paws scrabbled frantically, his claws scratching and tearing at the hippo's face in a frenzy of desperate, reckless devotion. Brutus froze. The colossal beast was utterly bewildered. In the brutal hierarchy of the African wetlands where his instincts were forged, threats came in the form of other massive hippos, stealthy crocodiles, or armed poachers. A small, furry, screaming projectile attaching itself to his face was entirely outside his biological paradigm. The sudden, sharp pain of canine teeth sinking into his sensitive snout, combined with the sheer audacity of the attack, broke the hippo's murderous trance. With a deafening, furious bellow that shook the surface of the water, Brutus snapped his head violently upward and to the side, trying to dislodge the biting nuisance. The sheer kinetic force of the movement was devastating. Rusty was ripped from his hold, his small body thrown backward through the air. He hit the surface of the swamp with a sickening splash, skipping once across the water before crashing heavily into the thick, black mud near the embankment. On the balcony, my breath caught in my throat. Sterling gripped the iron railing so tightly I thought it might bend. Marcus let out a low curse. Rusty lay in the mud, his reddish-brown coat stained black. He was clearly in immense pain. I could see the unnatural heave of his ribs. The impact had undoubtedly bruised or fractured bones. But the dog did not stay down. Whimpering, shaking the mud from his eyes, Rusty forced himself back up onto his trembling paws. He planted his feet in the sludge, bared his teeth, and unleashed a barrage of frantic, deafening barks directly at the hippo, deliberately pulling the monster's attention away from the crippled lioness. Brutus turned his massive, scarred head toward the barking dog, his small, dark eyes narrowing with fresh irritation. He took a heavy, sloshing step toward Rusty. That brief distraction, a window of perhaps 3 seconds bought with blood and unimaginable courage, was all Maya needed. Fueled by a sudden, massive surge of maternal adrenaline, the lioness refused to die in the mud. Ignoring the blinding agony of her shattered hind leg, Maya forced her upper body off the ground. She lunged forward, balancing entirely on her right hind leg and her front paws. With a guttural roar that vibrated the water around her, Maya swung her massive right paw in a devastating arc. Her unsheathed claws, thick and sharp as butcher's hooks, slashed across the left side of Brutus's face, tearing a deep, jagged line directly across the hippo's left eye and down his cheek. The strike was perfect. Brutus recoiled violently, letting out a high-pitched, gargling shriek of genuine agony. The water churned into a frothing white maelstrom as the hippo thrashed blindly in retreat. The pain of the lacerated eye, coupled with the chaotic, two-front assault from both a lion and a dog, finally overwhelmed his territorial aggression. Deciding the shallow water was no longer worth the fight, Brutus backed away, his massive body submerging into the deeper, darker trench of Subdivision 4, leaving behind a swirling cloud of mud and blood. A heavy, breathless silence descended upon the sanctuary, broken only by the steady patter of the cold drizzle and Rusty's ragged panting. Maya did not pursue. Her golden eyes tracked the ripples in the water until she was certain the hippo was gone. Then, her massive head sagged. She turned awkwardly, her shattered left leg dragging uselessly through the water behind her, and hobbled toward the muddy bank where Rusty stood. The lioness reached the shivering, battered golden retriever. She gently nudged him with her blood-stained nose, inhaling his scent, checking him for fatal wounds. Rusty leaned against her heavy, wet mane, letting out a soft, whimpering sound of relief. Then, Maya opened her jaws, the same jaws capable of crushing a zebra's spine, and with unimaginable gentleness, she took the scruff of Rusty's neck between her teeth. Dragging her own broken body, bearing the agonizing weight of her injuries, the lioness limped backward up the slick embankment. She pulled her adopted son out of the freezing mud, step by excruciating step, retreating toward the safety of the concrete den where Leo was waiting. Up on the balcony, I slowly lowered the useless tranquilizer rifle. I looked to my right. Richard Sterling, the man who had arrived at my sanctuary to tear it down, was completely silent. The pristine real estate tycoon was weeping. Tears mingled with the cold rain on his pale cheeks. He had just watched a creature of absolute power and a creature of absolute vulnerability risk everything they had to save each other. He had witnessed a loyalty so profound it defied the very laws of nature. And in that muddy, bloody swamp, the frozen architecture of his heart had finally begun to crack. I did not wait for Richard Sterling to speak, nor did I wait for Marcus to clear the way. The moment Brutus's massive, scarred back disappeared beneath the dark, swirling surface of the flooded plaza, I vaulted over the rusted railing of the guard post staircase. I hit the ground running, my heavy work boots plunging immediately into the knee-deep, freezing sludge. I ignored the thick, suctioning pull of the mud and the submerged debris that scraped against my shins. My only focus was the muddy embankment leading up to the feline sector, where a broken mother was dragging her dying son. Maya had collapsed just inches from the entrance of the concrete-reinforced sleeping quarters. The magnificent African lioness lay entirely flat against the wet earth, her chest heaving with violent, ragged gasps. The rain had washed away some of the mud, revealing the horrific extent of her injuries. Her left hind leg was shattered, the bones splintered beneath the torn, bleeding flesh. Yet, even in her blinding agony, Maya's maternal instinct eclipsed her pain. She had curled her massive front legs tightly around Rusty, shielding his small, battered body from the cold drizzle. Rusty was barely alive. The 60-pound golden retriever mix, usually a blur of reddish-brown energy, lay terrifyingly still. His fur was matted with black swamp mud and his own blood. I dropped to my knees beside them, the foul water soaking through my denim jeans. I placed a trembling hand on Rusty's ribs. His breathing was dangerously shallow, a wet, rattling sound that indicated severe internal trauma. Maya let out a low, exhausted chuff at my approach, but she did not bare her teeth. She simply rested her heavy, blood-stained chin over Rusty's neck, her golden eyes locking onto mine with a silent, desperate plea. A moment later, a frantic whining echoed from the shadows of the den. Leo, the adolescent lion cub, bounded out into the gray daylight. Though he possessed the thick, muscular body of a 200-pound predator, in that moment, he was nothing more than a terrified child. Leo dropped to his belly, crawling through the mud to reach his mother and his adopted brother. He curled his massive frame around Rusty's back, whimpering softly as he began to frantically lick the mud and blood from the dog's torn ears. A heavy splashing sound drew my attention away from the animals. I looked up. Richard Sterling was descending the final steps of the guard post. The 60-year-old real estate tycoon, a man who had built an empire by paving over the wild, was wading directly into the heart of the swamp. His immaculate, bespoke Italian leather shoes were instantly swallowed and ruined by the murky sludge. The hem of his expensive charcoal trench coat dragged heavily in the contaminated water, but he did not seem to notice or care. He walked with a slow, almost mechanical gait, his eyes fixed entirely on the tableau before him. Marcus followed closely behind, his broad shoulders hunched against the rain, his tough exterior cracked by the sheer emotional weight of the morning. Sterling stopped just a few feet away from where I knelt in the mud. The cold, calculating arrogance that usually defined his pale blue eyes had been entirely burned away. His eyes were bloodshot, swimming with unshed tears, and his face was pale and slack. He had witnessed it all. He had seen a small, insignificant dog willingly throw itself into the jaws of a 4,000-pound monster to save the apex predator that had once offered it shelter. Sterling had spent his entire life operating on the belief that everything in the world was transactional, that every living creature was driven purely by selfish gain and survival. But here, bleeding out in the mud, was a defiance of his entire universe. Here was a sacrifice so pure, so entirely devoid of logic or self-interest, that it broke the very foundation of how he understood the world. Sterling reached a trembling hand into the inner breast pocket of his ruined trench coat. He pulled out a thick envelope of crisp, water-resistant legal documents, the foreclosure agreement and the eviction mandate that gave him the absolute right to bulldoze this sanctuary and sentence these animals to death. He stared at the documents for a long time. The heavy silence of the Everglades stretched between us, broken only by the cold drizzle and Rusty's labored breathing. Sterling looked at the paper, then looked at the lion family huddled in the mud. He looked at Maya, who was watching him with tired, unblinking eyes, and at the small dog she refused to let go. Without a single word, Richard Sterling closed his eyes. His hands clamped down on the thick stack of legal papers. With a sudden, violent motion, he ripped the documents in half. Then he tore them again, and again. He shredded the eviction notice into tiny, meaningless pieces of white confetti, opening his hands and letting the scraps fall. The Everglades wind caught the torn contract, scattering the pieces across the murky, flooded water like dead leaves. He did not look at me as he turned around and trudged back through the mud toward the guard post, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that Exotic Hope had just been saved. We did not lose them that day. Sarah arrived 3 hours later. The 28-year-old assistant, tall, impossibly thin, and fiercely determined, had abandoned her flooded pickup truck and hiked the last 2 miles on foot, carrying 50 pounds of medical supplies on her back. We turned the guard post into a triage center. It took 2 agonizing surgeries and months of physical therapy, but Sarah's desperate, brilliant veterinary skills saved Maya's leg from amputation and pulled Rusty back from the brink of a collapsed lung. That was 15 years ago. I am 55 now. The dark hair in my beard has surrendered entirely to white, and my knees ache when the humidity drops. But I still sit on this same wooden porch, watching the sun sink below the sawgrass horizon. The dilapidated cages and rusting fences are gone, replaced by state-of-the-art veterinary facilities and vast open-range habitats. The wooden archway over the main gate no longer reads Exotic Hope. It proudly bears the name, the Sterling and Rusty Conservation Foundation. Down in the shade of a massive, sprawling palm tree, the namesakes of this sanctuary are resting. Rusty is an old dog now. He is 15, mostly deaf, and his reddish-brown muzzle has turned completely snow-white. His joints are stiff with arthritis, and he walks with a pronounced limp, but his spirit remains unbroken. He is currently asleep, using the massive, glorious golden mane of a fully grown male lion as his personal pillow. Leo, now a magnificent 600-pound king of his enclosure, rests his heavy chin gently over the old dog's back, keeping him warm just as his mother had done all those years ago. Maya passed away peacefully of old age 2 years ago, but her legacy lives on in the unbreakable bond between the lion and the dog. A silver pickup truck pulls up to the main gate. Richard Sterling steps out. He is 75 now, his posture slightly stooped. He is not wearing a silk suit or Italian leather shoes. He is wearing a faded denim shirt, comfortable jeans, and scuffed work boots. He carries a large bag of premium dog treats and a massive beef bone. He smiles as he walks toward the enclosure, a genuine, warm smile that reaches his eyes. Sometimes, as I sit here listening to the cicadas, I wonder about the nature of miracles. People who visit the sanctuary often say the miracle was the dog saving the lion from the hippo's mouth. But I know better. The physical survival of the animals was a triumph, yes. But the true miracle, the one that altered the course of all our lives, was not fought with teeth and claws in the muddy swamp. The real miracle was the quiet, profound moment when their pure, cross-species sacrifice managed to shatter the ice around a human heart, teaching a man who had everything that the only currency that truly matters is love. The greatest lesson we can take from this story is that true love knows no boundaries. A small dog was willing to give his life for a lion simply because she loved him first. That pure sacrifice was powerful enough to melt the frozen heart of a man who only cared about wealth and power. In our daily lives, we often build walls around ourselves and judge others by their appearance or status. But just like Rusty and Maya, we can choose to protect and care for one another unconditionally. Sometimes, a small act of kindness or a selfless choice can completely change the world for someone else. It reminds us to be gentle and to give love without expecting anything in return. If this story touched your soul, please share it with your friends and family so they can feel this warmth too. I invite you to subscribe to the channel so we can continue to explore these beautiful miracles together. May God bless you and your loved ones with health and a heart full of peace. If you believe that love can truly conquer fear and create miracles, please leave a comment saying Amen below.